Before we start, I want to thank you, the listener to the Innovation Show. One of the biggest influences on my career and this show was Charles Handy, the late Charles Handy, who was a winner of the Thinkers50 Lifetime Achievement Award. I was awarded that award the other day for innovation from the Thinkers50. There's the award that they gave me. And I joined Charles Handy, which is just incredible to me. And I want to thank you, the listener of the show, and the people who've been on the show, the people on those shelves behind me who've been part of this show for a very, very long time. Thank you so much for all your support, and thanks to Thinkers50 for recognizing the Innovation Show, first ever podcast recognized. So thank you to everybody who's always listened to the show. Thank you also to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find our friends Kyndryl at KYNDRYL, Kyndryl.com. How to gain your boss's support for crazy out-of-the-box ideas that could change the world seems relevant to a question about American or any innovation. Little is written from this bottom-up view about how to garner support if you're an intrapreneur, or importantly, how to grant it if you are a manager. The good news is that there are rules, discoverable, learnable, applicable, effective and actionable rules that can be adopted. These are described via several frustrating case studies where our guest first learned them. He calls them the Intrapreneur's Rulebook and Intrapreneuring Manager's Playbook. The Rulebook and the Playbook evolved from repeated intrapreneurial experiences plus a decade of codifying and teaching managerial and leadership practices to embed these concepts in a major international corporation. By the way, it's a few decades because he wrote this a while back. We are incredibly honored to have him with us for a first-hand account from the man responsible for so many entrepreneurial pursuits that he earned the one and only Medal of Defiance from Hewlett-Packard founder David Packard, which reads, Medal of Defiance, awarded in recognition of extraordinary contempt and defiance beyond the normal call of engineering duty. It is an honor to welcome the Medal of Defiance winner, serial intrapreneur and author of This Beauty, Permission Denied, Charles Chuckhouse. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Aidan. It's a pleasure to be here, and you kind of honor me with that opening.
It's a brilliant book, Chuck. As I said to you off air, that Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, is so true. And when I read your story, and I shared excerpts to people I know who are doing similar work to you that you were doing back in the 1960s, 70s, and they're like going, oh my God, that could be talking about me. Maybe we'll share just a little bit of context because you've seen it now from the outside, but this was written almost from an inside view, how these problems don't go away.
Well, first of all, that does chronicle times that were 50, 60, 70 years, almost certainly a lifetime ago. And you have to wonder, is that contemporary got any value today? And the answer is, I've seen it throughout my entire life. I'm running a startup at the moment, and my partner is a classic entrepreneur. He's maddening. It's hard to work with him, and his ideas are brilliant, and his skills are impeccable. He never could get a hearing by his bosses, and he wound up, actually, we went out on the side, and I have to tell you, it's fun to work with him, and rereading the book is like, oh my God, this is what I should be doing today with him. I have to tell you, though, where the book came from, because the issue was along a fairly lengthy career, almost 30 years with Hewlett-Packard. Eventually, after retirement, I decided to write the history of Hewlett-Packard, again with another colleague, and we call it the HP Phenomenon. It's published by Stanford Press. It's a classic business book. Wound up at the time was Stanford's third best-selling business book ever. That's not a real high bar compared to Harvard Business School, but anyway, it was a well-received book, except in my home division of HP in Colorado Springs. Then two ex-general managers called me And each said, how come you didn't have our division front and center? And I said, well, it's really simple. We were trying to tell a positive story about Hewlett-Packard. And our division was always the doormat. We were up against Tektronix. We got beat on every turn. And they said, well, you beat them a couple times yourself with your display program and your logic program. Why don't you write another book that focuses only on that part of our shared career? So I wrote this actually in response to two general managers saying, my God, you ought to tell our story because it's very different than the Hewlett-Packard story.
It's brilliant, man. I loved it. And actually, I compared it. I have the HP phenomenon. I have the HP way, which was written by the founders. And I compared what they said versus actually what happened in the halls, like what happened to you. And I thought I'd start off with a little statement here, just to give people a feel here. And just, you can do a Control F replace and replace Chuck here with yourself in any way. So Chuck says here, and it's such a sad but common statement, serial innovators can both exist as entrepreneurs pioneering new ideas and companies, and as intrapreneurs growing and reinvigorating corporations. If permission is denied consistently and pervasively denied by managers and erstwhile leaders, entrepreneurs have few options. One is to become a contrarian, defiantly fighting the system. A second is to leave, finding a smaller receptive company or becoming an entrepreneur like your colleague now, Chuck. And the third, sadly by far the most common, is to scale back your expectations, lower your creative quotient, and give in. And as I said in a post recently on LinkedIn, the great Dee Hock, who was the founder of Visa, was on the show many times, and he said some people just retire on the job. And one person described this to you, that they check their brain at the door. This was a lady who said when her startup was acquired by IBM, this is what she did. Let's talk about that, because that is everywhere.
So that woman, actually, I had never met her, but she is the daughter-in-law of the gal who co-founded a software publishing corporation coming out of Hewlett-Packard, which was significant. It never has gotten press for it, but it was the first almost all female-led startup in Silicon Valley in the 70s. And so this woman's son, like 25 years later, so we were there talking about the HP book and having a good time. She says, you ought to meet my daughter-in-law. And this vivacious gal bounces through the door. And I said, well, where are you at? Well, I was at this little startup, and what we did was, and and I mean, just bubbling. And then I said, what are you doing now? She said, well, IBM bought us about 6 months ago. And I said, how's that going? And she said, I show up for work and they ask me to check my brain at the door. And I thought, what a great line. And the only thing she wouldn't let me do was use her name in the book. Understandable.
You experienced that, and you saw it with so many great colleagues over the years.
Oh, yeah. That's unfortunately the name of the game. And the great service that Gifford Pinchot did when he wrote his book about entrepreneuring was he gave voice to a lot of people. He's got Art Fry with 3M doing, he made a glue that didn't stick that became Post-it notes. The guy that did the Pontiac Fiero, the guy that did the Mustang for Ford. All of these were crazy cockamamie ideas. And most people in management roles just hate to have uncertainty. They'd rather have a small win that's guaranteed than a large win that's speculative. And so I just, that's not been my life. And so I wanted to give voice to at least my perspective.
And you do it so many times, and you kept consistently doing it, which was interesting. You didn't give up. And there's a line here that I thought was really important. You said, as companies become more successful, paradoxically, the capacity to make investments for the day after tomorrow grows, but the will and courage to implement an innovation strategy evaporates. And you told me off air, the significance of this today is that AI and machine learning are the new paradigm, and innovation teams everywhere have to deal with this, along with, most importantly, their bosses who might not agree about the imperative of these things. Maybe you'll elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, that could open chapters. But AI is a good example. We had a dinner party last weekend, and we had, what do we have? 8 people, 8 professionals, 4 men and 4 women. And I have to tell you that 3 of the 8 were absolutely convinced that AI is killing the world. Their own jobs are affected badly. They've had sons and daughters lose their jobs because AI has displaced them. They could cite chapter and verse the problems that AI gets wrong, as can my wife and I. and after they left, Jenny said, "Let me tell you the opportunities I'm seeing right now that we've never been able to do that I could do with OpenAI or I could do with ChatGPT." And she starts outlining like 3 new companies just right off the bat. And you go, "How come you didn't say that last night?" She said, "The climate wasn't right. They weren't in a receptive mood to listen." And I think in a small way, that reflects exactly how managers thinking about it around the loop. The other one, Vince Cerf, given credit as one of the founders of the internet. I was talking with him one day. He said, "Well, one thing I did," he said, "I asked Gemini if it could do my obituary." He said, "And I figured I would know most of the points that it brought up." He said, "It writes this flowery thing." And he said, "God, I was a paragon of virtue." But he said, "You can't believe how many things I did that I've never heard of."
Yeah, that's so true.
So, there's both sides of the coin. It doesn't matter whether we were going from a communication to switching circuits in the 60s, from hardware to software in the 80s, from raw data to databases and data banks and big data in the 2000s. Now we're going to machine language and AI today. And every one of those steps is threatening to the old guard and seething with opportunity for the kids that see it. So if you haven't heard the phrase, "Well, we didn't used to do it that way," park that one.
It's an important thing, and I'm jumping ahead here, but one of the things you talk about was you were a history scholar and you had the occasion to meet Thomas Kuhn. And ironically, I was laughing at the fact that Kuhn didn't really want to be challenged by you when you met him. But the whole idea of Thomas Kuhn and the idea of a paradigm shift. And one of the things you call out was the shift from vacuum tubes to transistors, and the resistance of that for many, many colleagues, and colleagues who thought maybe a night school course was enough to be able to upskill to move with that shift. But as a result, you saw so many people lose their jobs. I'd love you to share that, because these are some of the echoes that you see, or the rhymes that Mark Twain talked about, that you see from generational shift to generational shift. When these new technologies come in, some people just resist them and get left behind. And then some people, as you say, embrace them and catapult themselves forward.
So the story, the way I kind of experienced it was, I was a sophomore in college and wound up married and had a child on the way and had to have a job. The issue, of course, our school required full-time enrollment. So what are you going to do? Well, I figured out 2 things. One is I could work afternoons and evenings, and I could go to school in the morning, but most of my half my classes were in the morning, half were in the afternoon. But at the time, nobody had computerized them. And so I could double enroll. And so I enrolled for 2 classes at 8 o'clock, 2 at 9 o'clock, 2 at 10 o'clock. And then I'm free by 11, right? So then I had to find somebody who knew the assignment so I could stay current in the course I didn't go to. So that's all going on. Well, the job I got was working in aerospace in Southern California as a draftsman. And they were just into the silicon structures, diodes and transistors, and all of their old designers were vacuum tube guys. And these guys are explaining to me that the problem with transistors was they'd have electrons that amplify, but they have holes. And what does it mean to have a hole in your device? The vacuum tube never had a hole in the device. And so they would explain to me patiently that this stuff can't work. And of course, it worked fine. And I didn't know any different. Well, the sequel is when I graduated, I went to Hewlett-Packard to work on instrumentation. I was the first person to build a solid-state circuit form. Everybody there was still doing vacuum tubes. It just 2 years later, 100% of the cars, the 98th engineer, I was the first one to use silicon devices. And you go, wow. Well, you could replicate that story today. I just finished a story about COVID. Actually, Ireland was one of the subject areas because there are some fairly interesting stories there. The UK even more so, because the people that were dying early were dying in much greater rates than the government ever told anyone. Well, you can map the data that they were supplying and just do a convolution integral shift for conformal mapping of when the deaths occurred compared to when the admission to the hospital occurred, and demonstrate these radically fatal numbers. And no one in the entire medical industry, anywhere I found around the world, understood conformal mapping or convolution integrals. You go, this is trivial mathematics. It's just graphical interpretation. And I did that first for an emphysema study in the 60s. And 60 years later, the technique is unknown, basically. So we're currently trying to teach it to the World Health Organization.
That emphysema story was an important experience for you because it gave you a different type of education. And here you wrote, who among us doesn't appreciate that personalities and prejudice, not to mention different skills and perspectives, often override fact, objectivity, and reasoning? Engineers and scientists, too, ignore this at their peril. Human nature intrudes and usually, in fact, prevails. So you were writing about the emphysema project and you were brought in. And it's I saw this as a really important lens through which to read the entire book because it planted a seed for the entire story as a backbone for the book's larger arc. That how do you prove a system that prefers ritual over results? I thought that was, you wrote that. How do you move a system that prefers rituals over results? And you saw this first there, and then saw also how diverse groups can work well together if they're harnessed, but also terribly if they're not harnessed.
I think Martin Luther wrote all that on didn't he? The 1513 exit thing on the door. Hey, here's some obvious things. And everybody's like, wow.
But let's tell our audience about this. So what I thought we would do is tell our audience about the emphysema project you were working on, some of the lessons you learned from that. Then we'll move to the history of your intrapreneurship really inside HP, the ups and downs, many downs as well that you had. But we'll tell about that. And then on part 2, we'd move more towards that rule book and the managerial rule book that you do towards the end of the book. So I'd love you to tell us a little bit about this project and what you learned from it first.
Well, let me describe the situation. So I'm an engineer at Hewlett-Packard. We're, happily droning along, if you will, doing some fairly interesting things. And I'm like, 29 years old. And I enrolled in some classes at the local college to do some graduate work. And it was on a hillside, and I'm late for class, and I'm running up the hill from the parking lot, and I'm out of breath. And I'd been a mountain climber for years. And it's like, well, what the hell? How come I'm having trouble breathing? I went to the doctor, and he pronounced that I had emphysema, which I'd never heard of at the time. And it was a fairly new disease being talked about. Went to the library and looked it up, and it had some interesting. First thing it said is there's no cure and there's no treatment, and you'll be dead in 20 years. And I'm thinking, well, no, wait a minute. I've got 3 kids at home and another one on the way. I want to hang around, And in the Denver Post, I lived in Colorado Springs, about 70 miles from Denver. And the Denver Post came out with a story that the new Clean Air Act of 1970 was establishing commissions to study air pollution for America. And I said to my wife, I want to be on that commission. Well, the first question is, how do you get on one? So I interviewed my boss at HP, and he said, I know a guy who knows the governor. And was I did like 20 mailings and got like 12 interviews with people. And all of a sudden the phone rings one day and says, I understand you're an air pollution expert. Well, sure. Would you like to be on our commission? Boom, I'm on the commission, right? So what I knew about air pollution was one class at Caltech, 15 years earlier, or maybe 10 years earlier. It was, nothing, in other words. I get up to this commission. The question is, what are we supposed to do? And the chairman is saying, well, we are the second worst state in America for emphysema death rate. Wow. Okay. That's why I'm here. I want to fix that. What causes it? Well, it's either big cities or it's smoking. Well, I'd never smoked and I'm not living in a big city. And he has a map then of the top 10 states in America with the worst 10 for emphysema death rate. Not one of them has a big city. And my wife at the time was a Mormon, and Utah was the 15th state out of 50, 15 out of 50. And I know they don't even allow cigarettes in the state, And I'm thinking, so smoking can't be theirs, and it can't be these big cities because that's not where everybody's dying, Montana and Idaho and Maine, and come on. So I said, could I study the data? And they gave me data for, 2,700 deaths over the last 2 decades from the Department of Health. And the question is, what do you do with that data? Big computer printout sheets, the old Z-fold paper. Well, it turned out HP that year had brought out a desktop calculator, essentially the first PC a decade before we really knew about PCs. And I had one at home, and I had a modem connection, and I could take a statistics course at a college 130 miles away, the first course of that type in America, by the way. I do all that. I put together these studies, and all of a sudden it leaps off the page that where people are dying are not in the cities. They're dying in the country, and they're dying in little air basins that had trapped toxic air. And you go, well, that's... So then I try to convince my fellows on this committee, and they're mostly pulmonary experts, and they thought I was just completely crazy. Well, it turned out we uncovered the first understanding of submicron particulate matter killing people. And today, emphysema is the third biggest killer in the world from exactly that cause. So I never got credit for that, but it took 25 years before our scholarly paper nailed the same thing. Today it's common wisdom.
That's the point. That's why I'm thank you for humoring me and telling the story. I think it's so important. So many intrapreneurs like you don't get the credit. There's a famous, I'm going to show it on the screen. I'm going to jump ahead. There's a famous electronics magazine article. I'm showing it on the screen there for our audience. You were celebrated, and this actually led to great heights for you in your career. But the other gentleman on it, BJ Moore, you tell us about him. He was also given an award, but he had nothing to do with the project. He was just the suit behind the project as well. And I share that firstly to give a chance to show this on screen and celebrate what you achieved. But secondly, that so many intrapreneurs don't get the chance to ever get the credit for the work that they do. The way I often say it is, a great guy I had on the show before, Jeffrey J. Fox, he had this brilliant saying that he said, you need to be a credit maker, not a credit taker. Let's share that, because I find that a tough one, Chuck, that I hated giving credit to these jackasses who are usually the people who are denying the project, and then you have to give them the credit.
So let me kind of is adjacent, but it bears on that story. So that emphysema work with Colorado was 1970 to 72. Okay. Fast forward to 2008. So what would that be? 38 years later. Okay. And I was hosting a project at Stanford. I was running an innovation group at Stanford at the time. And I found a project that was studying graphics around innovation from a gal at Indiana University. I called her to say, and she had run this contest for NSF for 6 years. She had 10 winners every year. And I said, how many times has that exhibit been shown west of the Mississippi? And she said, none, never. And I said, what would it take to show it here? She said, you have to pay the freight to ship the poster boards out. Done. So I ran this thing for 6 months at Stanford. Fantastic show. But one day, one of my advisors said, I want you to come to breakfast and meet a guy. Okay. Why? Well, he's just an important guy back in Washington. So I go, and his name is Warren Muir, M-U-I-R. And while over breakfast rolls and coffee at this guy's house, I say, so are you related to John Muir, the guy that did all the environmental stuff, Yosemite National Park and stuff like that? He said, well, actually, yes, in a kind of an indirect way, and so he goes down that. And then he says, why did you do this exhibit? I said, well, years ago, it's interesting. I got interested in emphysema, and I found the reason for why all this works. He said, and he got stony faced, and he said, no, you didn't. I said, what do you mean? Yeah, yes, I did. He said, what'd you find? Kind of accusatory. This guy's like 65 years old, balding and gray, and what do you mean? And so I told him what I found. And he looked stunned. And then he said, what year was this? And I said, 71 is when I first published. He said, in 74, I was a graduate student, and I found the exact same thing. And I said, what'd you do with it? He said, they wouldn't let me publish. And I said, what do you do today? He was chairman of the Environmental Protection Agency for America when I'm talking with him. And he never got credit for it. And it didn't trouble him. It's just the two of us being in a room to have that discussion, for me, is the credit I love.
Wow. Well, you're a bigger man than me, because some of the struggles you had that I know, when you have the person who's actually the person who's been the biggest blocker, and then all of a sudden they're standing up there giving presentations as if they invented the thing. That's the one. I'm sure you've had a few of that.
The pulmonary expert on the commission, fought me tooth and nail. And I found something like 15 years later where he basically was claiming he had invented all this stuff. And you go, okay, well, whatever.
Well, yeah. Anyway, man, we better keep it. So let's jump into the FAA story, and one that inadvertently landed on your lap. Literally, it wasn't your first choice. And I'll give you a bit of context here to set us up and tell us about this story, because this is really where the HP story starts in the book. And at the time, this is important to know, and please give us context here. Virtually all computers use punch cards or teletype interfaces to input programs. These are the old, massive, big computers. The idea of an interactive screen that we're on today, that we take for granted on computers, laptops, tablets, smartphones, that was completely unknown. There wasn't even any type of thing to do a barcode in a grocery store, let alone something as complicated as a screen like we have today. So that's where we'll pick up the story. Tell us about the list. Your boss who liked you going, you can pick anything on this list to work on. And it wasn't actually quite the truth.
So think about, imagine a tablet today, a PC tablet. Get rid of the screen, and everything you hold there is what a computer was at the time. You had the keyboard, and you had whatever the enters were. You might have one line printout, or you might just have a teletype that you had to print it off on, like a typewriter kind of thing. That was it. The notion of displays was pretty radical, but I didn't start there. I'd just been busy doing a couple of projects. I considered myself the fair-haired boy in the division, or the group, but he clearly didn't have the same perspective. He sat me down. He said, okay, it's time to pick some new projects. Here's a list of all the projects we're thinking about. I don't know, 12 or 15 lists. I said, well, how about this one and this one? He said, oh, I've already given those to Chuck Gustafson. Huh? Why would you show me a list that's already had some things taken off the list? And well, that answer was pretty not forthcoming. So the question was, okay, what else do you want to do? And I'm looking at this thing, and it said FAA control tower display. And I said, well, what's that? I don't know anything about that. Well, it's this request we got from the Aviation Administration that they'd like to have something for a control tower that would show planes, orbiting, and you could use them for tracking making sure planes are safe around the airports. Okay. Why don't you go talk to Milt Russell? He knows a little more about it. And it turned out the guy he referred me to had built these things for General Electric with 5-foot long tubes and these were huge things. And he said, I think I know a way to make that tube much shorter. It would look almost like a TV set if we did it. And why would that matter? Well, they could put letters on this is United Airlines 721 coming in, and here's Delta something else, and here's British Airways, and oh, great, let's try that. Well, it turned out his technique for making the tube short, you couldn't read the letters. So, they defocused too badly. So basically, it didn't work for the one application that we were asked to consider. But I had built this box, and you could show anything at a distance. So back then, oscilloscopes had like a 5-inch display tube, and this was like a 12-inch. So in terms of scaling, huge. And people said, well, that'd be a long-armed, nearsighted engineer to see that, or it'd be a fast TV set. You could watch Gandhi in 3 minutes. And there's no market for this kind of thing. Well, I went on a little market research trip, and I found several people that thought it'd be pretty interesting, including one in Hollywood that said, we're thinking about how you might build movies with computer graphics. It turns out their first movie, which was in progress but hadn't made any real progress, was Tron. Tron eventually became quite famous because of my box. And we pursued this thing. We built it. Dave Packard came out for a division review, and it wasn't important enough for me to show him. It was shown, and then the discussion happened after I was out of the room. And he said something to the effect of, how many is just going to sell? The marketing director said like 31. And he said, well, when I come back, I don't want to see it in the lab. I was told that the next day, and I said, well, does that mean we're supposed to stop? Or does that mean we're supposed to have it in production? And my boss was, well, of course it means we're supposed to stop. And I said, well, my dad wants 2 of them, and that's 6% of the world market right there. And so we ought to build it. We only needed about $60,000 to do it. And back then that was a fair amount of change, but it still was not huge. He let us go, and we built it. The next year it was out on the market. By the time Packard came for the annual visit, we had sold 40, more than the 31 for a worldwide sale. He blew a head gasket. I said to kill this son of a bitch, pounding the table. I said, no, sir, what you said was you didn't want to see it in the lab. It's not, it's in production. It turned out that wasn't a very good answer.
Well, it got you this. I'm going to show on the screen what it got you. It got you the first and only ever Medal of Defiance Award. Yeah. So those people watching this on YouTube, that's what Chuck got as a result.
So, yeah, the sequel to that story is he went away, and we wound up selling 17,000 units or something. So it was really the first computer graphics display ever sold commercially by any computer manufacturer. We were ahead of IBM by 4 years. We were ahead of Digital Equipment by 11 years for introducing a graphics terminal. But our own company didn't want it. The customers forced us to put the two together as opposed to we sold it as an idea. So again, one of those things of who's in love with something versus who isn't. So 15 years later, I get an opportunity to become the corporate engineering director of the entire company. By then we had 91 divisions. We had, 42,000 people, of whom like 15,000 are engineers. And I'm going to run the engineering group, okay? And my office is going to be next door to David Packard in Palo Alto and not in Colorado Springs. And I didn't know him really well. I mean, I knew him and he knew me, but it wasn't like we had dinner very often together kind of thing. Anyway, for my going away party in Colorado Springs, I get that damn plaque awarded to me, along with one of those things when you turn 50, they give you a cane with a honker on it. It was a total roast. And I thought it was a gag gift. Well, I moved to Palo Alto, and I have this office set up, and I've got that plaque sitting on a bookshelf. Gifford Pinchot came by, and he says, "What is that?" And I told him, "That's this stupid plaque." He said, "Where did you get it?" And I told him. He said, "Can I take a picture?" He took a Polaroid picture. About 2 weeks later, I threw the plaque away. I mean, about a year later, he shows up with somebody from corporate publications, and they want to do this book, and it's chapter 1. And he said, "Here's the Polaroid shot." I said, "That's the only example that ever existed." I threw the son of a bitch away. And for years, I still thought it was a gag gift. He put it in the book as though it was real, but I thought it was a gag gift. Well, it turns out some years after that, when Packard was doing his autobiography, he put it in. I don't know if you noticed that. It's in there. And he says something like, "What do you do with someone who's insubordinate when they're right?" It turned out he had actually given the award, and he gave it because his sense was that HP was losing that creativity. And he said that'll be an example that people can use as a way to say it's okay to go up against your boss.
When I read about you, I was like, it's kind of like you're a musical artist and people keep saying, play that song. You're like, oh, I'm sick of playing that song. There's way more songs on the album and the nuances, and that's where there's so much richness that people can see and learn from you that I really want to talk about today. There was a couple of things like that. For example, you were so committed to getting this over the line where you went out on sales trips yourself and you wanted to take the unit to some potential customers. You were strongly told no by HP, and they did not allow engineers go alone to customers because they had to send a sales rep with you. That was one thing. Then you couldn't afford extra travel expenses. And third, HP didn't allow prototypes to be shown to customers in case it tipped off competitors.
Right.
But you brought it out. You had the Volkswagen Beetle. You had your family. You joined it onto a holiday. You used to take out the front seat to be able to fit this unit in. So I just wanted to show the commitment of it. And then a bit of serendipity. Unfortunate serendipity for the other guy. A heart attack of one of your colleagues. And he wanted to be able to monitor his own heart. And his wife was a nurse.
Yeah.
And you had immediately an application for your product. I'd love you to share some of the serendipitous moments like that, but the fact that you put yourself in the way of serendipity by actually doing the hard work.
So even before, Dave asked that we cancel it, I was getting pushback from our division that there's no market for this thing. And I just felt if I could get in front of some people and show them this thing, it would work. So we had this Christmas trip scheduled to go back from Colorado to Southern California. And I ran into this rule that you had to have an HP guy with you, a salesperson with you. And I called the office in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and the one near Phoenix. And they said, well, that's Christmas holidays. We're on vacation. And I said, well, I've got this thing I want to show to Burr Brown, engineering. Would it be all right if I went in? The guy says, oh, sure, be my guest. So that's how I got around the salesperson thing. Burr Brown was a competitor to HP in recorders, and I'm there, and they said, well, why are you showing it to us? You compete with us. And I said, not in space video, we don't. And because they were showing it to Kit Peak or somebody who was involved in the space program. And so stuff like that. But yeah, and this damn box was 2 foot on a 2 foot cube. Okay. And, probably weighed, 70 pounds or so. I had to take the front seat of the Volkswagen out at the hotel, leave it with the family, and go get the box at the airport and so forth. I took it back to the airport after I'd shown it in New Mexico, and I handed it to the guy, and it's got marked fragile all over. I handed it to this guy, and he tosses it about 12 feet over to the conveyor belt. And as he's tossing it, he said, do you want to insure it? And I said, yeah, for $25,000. I thought he was going to catch it. It's like, what the hell's in there? I said, it's the only computer display in America.
Well, and you didn't even know what that meant, I'm sure. Let's pull on a couple of more threads here. There's stuff here that maybe you didn't see as that important, but they're actually like templates for people. So one of the problems that you say loomed was that you as a team had no priority versus other projects that vied for already overloaded support services. And you found a case of beer for the model shop folk. So to bring them in for the weekend, you basically bribe them with a keg. That's an important thing, because one of the problems that you see with entrepreneurs like you were then was that you have no power and you have nothing to offer. So you have to almost trade in goodwill. That was one thing. And then as you neared the end, the manufacturing department, which had no veto power over any new release from the labs, voted no on building your product as well. They're just a couple of little things that I'd love you to riff on.
Well, the model shop one is, I mean, if you think about who are the important cogs in the wheel that never get credit, the industrial designer never gets credit. The gal on the front desk never gets credit. The model shop never gets credit. And I came up kind of, I won't say dirt poor, but my dad was a traveling salesman calling on blacksmith shops and things like that. And he taught me early on, treat everybody with the same dignity you'd like to be treated with. And I went to these guys and I said, it just looks like there's no schedule at all. And they said, well, we could always do something after hours. What would that take? He said, well, a keg would go a long way. Boom, we had that done. So it really works. And I think the secret, what you really outlined there, you have the power of persuasion, or the power of the pen, or the power of, you've got a number of resources that may not look obvious, but you have them. You can buttonhole people, and just the fact that you're excited can get other people excited. And, I guess I trade on that sometimes.
For sure. I think that's such an important thing. And I wanted to point out a couple of things, because you're very transparent about this, some of the mistakes that you made. And at one stage, you were given an opportunity to talk about the program to a division-wide group, and you naively gave this speech that drew on your experiences from the Thomas Kuhn stuff, the 4 stages that an entrepreneur endures.
Yeah.
So let's tell about that. So maybe I'll tee you up with this. You said, first, your original ideas gets ignored, too radical. Second, when the idea grows, it's seen as a threat, or others try to stop it. Third, as momentum builds, they try to corrupt, debase, or emasculate the idea to rid it of its truly radical capability. And then when it succeeds, they're quick to take credit for creating, modifying, or completing the idea. That's the kind of idea mapped to the Kuhn stuff. But tell us about what happened to you as a result of this.
Yeah, that was a witless situation, really. We were one of the outlier divisions for HP. Colorado Springs wasn't exactly the center of Hewlett-Packard. But we had people from Bell Labs came to visit, and my boss's boss asked, hey, they're interested in this display that you built. Why don't you tell the story of inventing it over lunch? So we'll have lunch, and you can kind of wheeze for 15 minutes, and it'll be good. So that's what I did. I told those 4 little steps, and which, of course, didn't put my boss in that good of a light. The Bell Labs people just went crazy, as did some of my colleagues, but I would not say any of the managers. So we're walking out, and my boss's boss is walking with me, and he said, you are fantastic with a speech. He said, you're so good, you could be on television. You tell a story just beautifully. In fact, he says, I think you should be on television. I'm taking you out of your job because we can't have you doing what you're doing. Until that moment, I thought, hey, I'm doing fine, boom. And that was it. I quit being a project manager that day. And for a while, but yeah, so be careful what you wish for, right?
Yeah. And they replaced you then, and it was a tough pill to swallow. The reason I share that is sometimes as an entrepreneur, you're happy to be able to get a dig in. You know what I mean by that? You're happy to be able to go, now's my chance to tell those so-and-so's what I feel, and actually inadvertently insult the person, but that person has the power and they never ever react well. Something like that, like you discovered.
I was pretty young and naive. I'm still pretty naive.
But we do, I spotted it. It's a thing we do because you feel it's unfair and you feel it's a way to actually get some type of justice, and it's tough not to take the shot when you have the opportunity as well. So I wanted to point that out because a few of us have made those mistakes over the years. So let's fast forward. In 1970, you were at the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, an annual international convention on a spying mission. So let's take it up from there, because what I loved about this was you got out of the building, that term that we use, innovation. You got out of the building, you got out there to see what's out, what's being demoed, and you were really looking at one of your major competitors here, and they knew you were looking at them as well.
Well, I wouldn't have called it a spying mission. It was just simply an information gathering kind of thing. And I didn't think of it as spying. But the net was HP was still the doormat in oscilloscopes. And I became project manager of what was going to become our next generation box. And this was 1970. Things like liquid crystal displays are possible. A lot of different semiconductors. We haven't yet seen the Intel 4004 memory chip, but we were right on the cusp of a lot of change happening with semiconductors.
Can we just maybe explain what an oscillator is? Because I thought I had an idea of it is, but maybe we'll explain what it is, because it's important to actually understand what this is as the story moves forward.
Okay, well, so you said oscillator. An oscillator is a signal generator. So you can generate square waves or sine waves, some kind of signal that then a receiver can read that signal. An oscilloscope is actually the tool to watch all that. So the best way to think about an oscilloscope is an EKG machine in medical. You see the thing that does the heartbeat. That's a version of an oscilloscope picture. And so you can see that in a dynamic way. Well, Tektronix had 90% of the worldwide market. HP had about 6%. Iwatsu was 3% in Japan, and Fairchild had 1%. So all of us were doormats to this dominant player who'd been there for 25 years. So I'm going to head the next generation for HP project to try and deal with their latest offering. And their latest offering had just come out, and it was high, wide, and handsome. I mean, it was glorious compared to anything that had ever been done in the past. And they're going to show it at this IEEE show in New York, across from Central Park. And you got to wear your name badge. Your name badge has your name and your company broadly. So it says Chuck House, Hewlett-Packard. And I was with another fellow. We wander into the Tektronix booth, and they, "Oh, hi, guys. We know you." Haha. Kind of thing. "And we're here to see your new box." Well, here it is. And everybody in their booth, they had just seen it for the first time themselves. Tektronix was an Oregon firm. And so the New York show was the first time the East Coast for Tektronix people had seen it. So they're fiddling with this thing and trying to figure out how it works. And both of us were pretty good at scopes. So we could show their employees how their box worked. Okay, we did that for 10 or 15 minutes, had a good time. And we're checking a bunch of stuff like linearity and the corner distortion and all this stuff. And they got enchanted by what we were finding. And then one of them says, "Well, hell, you guys know how to demo our stuff better than we do. Why don't you stay in the booth and demo it through the day?" I mean, talk about an invitation. So, okay. So we did. So for 5 hours, we stand there and we demo their box to their customers. And you get to say, how much good would this do for you? What are your real problems? And so we're basically doing market research on their customers with their machine in their booth. And we did that all day long and learned a lot. And go home. And my conclusion out of that was we have to cancel our project. We are so far behind and we're so under-resourced that it'd be folly to compete with that. We ought to find another arena to compete with. And that's where the Logic Analyzer Group came from. The sequel, though, some years later, a book came out about Tektronix, a biography like my HP book. Okay. And the guy says, there was a time the two guys from Hewlett-Packard came into their booth. Huh? Can you believe it? So it made it into Tektronix lore as well as in ours.
There's some really important things here. The first thing was, again, this term, get out of the building. You said here, the real learning was sociological. We found out how big their R&D team was. So this is Tektronix, the development time and schedules they had, and which capabilities they still needed for further refinement. The 7000 series, you said, was like an overground Swiss Army knife. But then you said you had this realization, we don't stand a chance with the project you called Next Gen at the time. Here's what I thought was so important. I shared this actually on an episode of the show with a live show we recorded already. So I recorded it last week with Alex Osterwalder, Howard Yu, and Sangeet Chowdhury, 3 brilliant minds and innovators and writers on innovation. But I told them about this. I told them about your bravery to kill your own project. And you said here, the first problem that is you were in love with it. You loved the project. And the second was that you viewed this as managerial redemption. And now that redemption was turning to suicide. And you said here, cancelling the project would be a certain death knell for my management hopes. You had personally defined the program, solo managed it, invested a selected few people in it, new technologies, built a crackerjack team, and made great progress compared to historic efforts. It was, as you saw it, your chance to recover from some prior management miscues. I wanted to talk about that because that bravery to kill it, when you knew it was wrong, so many people don't do it. And just the feeling of that, the honesty of it as well.
Well, trying to get through that period, it was like agony. I did love what we'd done. We had technology that at that point hadn't been done anywhere. And I'd had a role in bringing some of that to fruition. So I was energized about how cool it was from a technology standpoint, what a contribution it might be, etc. And I had this vindication need, was pretty strong. I wanted to have that power. The issue was the facts were pretty incontrovertible. I mean, this damn thing isn't going to fly, And so to preside over it over another year, only to have it go down in flames, would be suicide in its own right. So the way I reconciled it was, hey, would you rather die now or later? And why not bite the bullet now rather than put another year of investment in this wasted effort? And so then the real question was, how do I stand tall to my own team who's working their heart out to make this thing work? Knowing that I'm going to urge to cancel it as soon as we show it, how can I tell them to keep working hard for the next 4 weeks and have integrity? And I found a way, I thought, to do that was really to ask them to teach me what problems they were having and why was it so hard. And so they got invested in trying to help me understand what was so hard about the assignment that we had and why it was taking them forever. Okay. And it was out of that learning that together we were able to formulate the ideas for logic. So it really had a positive denouement. There were several weeks there where I'm feeling two-faced about knowing I'm going to kill it and knowing these poor bastards are working their heart out, right?
It's a tough one. It's such a tough one. And, it's something that a lot of innovators face. They know deep down, but they know it's going to affect them. And they have to wear that mask for a while. So we're in 1970 and you've bought 6 acres, a plant nursery, a garden center, all right in the middle of a recession. And you're doing some landscaping at the weekend just in case, because so many engineers are driving taxis and you're like going, well, I worked as a landscaper before. I enjoy it. This would be better than driving a taxi for me. But you've worked on this project, DWUK, D-W-U.
Yeah, the DWUK.
The DWUK. And you and your team decide to resign until fate steps in, as it seemed it so often did, and your colleague Dar Howard gives you some air cover and encourages you to keep going. Let's pick up the story there. You fill in the gaps and tell us about DWUK.
First, I'll tell you a little bit about the landscaping thing. So I do this landscaping thing on the side with my wife and another couple that I knew outside HP. And one day I'm doing work for one of the guys who worked for me. Okay. He said, why don't you landscape my yard? So I'm up digging holes to plant trees in his backyard, and his wife is just reading me off. You're not digging the right place. You're not digging, a fairly unhappy woman and really blistering me. And he comes home, sees her berating me, and he says, honey, that's my boss.
Brilliant.
One of the priceless moments of my life.
Oh, brilliant.
So this guy that came home, and we had 5 people on this team, and we're building this box, and it could do a serial trigger. So it could handle signals that came in sequence, and it could identify a sequence, or it could do it in parallel. It could do 5 or 6 signals or 8 signals at once and recognize the pattern. So we had a parallel trigger, we had a serial trigger, we had a countdown mechanism, we had something else, I've forgotten what else. And so we called it the digital waveform conditioner. And so D was for digital, WU was for waveform underlying computer knowledge or something. I don't know. Anyway, and it was a little plug-in for an oscilloscope. And so the notion was we have to show this to somebody and figure out if it matters. And the only place you could show it that would matter inside HP was the HP Computer Division in the Bay Area. And we're in Colorado Springs. Travel money was always pretty tight. So what I figured out was I'm going to go on vacation to Canada. It took the family. We drove to Banff. We drove over to Vancouver. We drove down the coast, stopped in Seattle. People were laying off engineers in Seattle. This was the height of the recession for the 70s recession when the military money ended after Vietnam. And anyway, get to Palo Alto. And my team has just arrived, and they've got the box, and we're glad to see each other. And we go to this show, and we turn it on with, 25 computer engineers in the room, and smoke fills the room. The thing just blows up. And the guy, one of the designers was a Swiss German, and he starts babbling in German. And he's basically saying, this is not good. This is not good. This good. And it wasn't. We just burned the damn thing up. So it turned out the guy gave us, one of the guy who set the meeting up, said, you're going to need some repair time. This was like on a Monday. And he gave us 3 days in his workshop. We put it together. We had it working by Thursday. He couldn't get the 25 people. He got like 4 to come. They watch it, and they said, we have never seen these kinds of signals. How are you doing this? So we have this great discussion about how it works. And then he said, kind of offhand, he said, I've got a friend over at IBM San Jose ought to see this. Let me give him a call. Okay. Now, HP's got this thing. You never show a prototype to anybody because you give away the story, right? So it's just like the displays thing. I said, well, I don't know. And he said, no, you really ought to do it. So we went down to see these guys. It turns out it was the team that designed the first Winchester disk drive. And they didn't advertise it that way, but that's who it was. And we show it to them. They didn't want us to leave the building. They said, you've got to leave that with us. Wow, that is unbelievable. Okay, so no, we got to have it. So we're driving back to the airport, and one of the team members says, we might have something here.
You think?
You think? So that's that story. Now, the sequel was HP Colorado Springs had a hard time hearing that story. So I tell that story also in the book. But that's how that happened.
Yeah. So let's keep going on the ups and downs, because now you're at a new dawn, quite literally. It's New Year's Eve, 1971. You had lost your team to a gent called Jim Petty, but now you have them back. But there's a twist here because you inherit some new engineers. The reason I mention this is it's a common occurrence in entrepreneurship. And as you put it, compared to my original team, 7 of the 8 designers were senior. Unexpectedly, they brought a product marketing manager, Dick Cochran. 5 scope lab designers rounded it out, but none with standout skills. The whole feeling to me seemed to resemble that of an expansion baseball team in Major League, where every extant owner offered the new team some utility infielders, disabled ball players, or fading stars, None were invested in having the new team produce a winning club in their near future. And later on in the book, you add, entrepreneurs often are saddled with team members who aren't there by choice, with a point of view firmly rooted in the old paradigm. That was gold, because that is a problem that's still everywhere.
Well, the nature of these businesses, these are a lot of people that may have been good in their day, but their creative juices have already been killed. They parked their brain at the door, 3 years ago or 8 years ago, and they're just hanging on. They're collecting a paycheck, and that's about it. As some would say, they can fog a mirror, but that's about the extent of it. So that's so it's luck of the draw, and these are designed by committee. They're designed pretty much by who's left over or who can't you stand and you don't want them part of your team because they're et cetera. And that's what we got. And the story at HP always was we're this paternalistic, we'll find a job for you. Don't worry. This is lifetime employment. This is back in the 60s and 70s. But anyway, we got 20 people or so assigned to us. A couple of them were really hard to work with. One of them had been in my college freshman group and flunked out. And when he came to our division and saw that I was there, it was like he wanted to exit stage left. But he wound up staying. And we were not terribly collegial. And now he's ordered to work for me. Well, you can guess the rest. Anyway, we had 20 people. At the end of a year, we still had 20 people, but we had gone through 80 names. It basically we weren't trying to it wasn't a guillotine kind of thing. It was just, this is what we're working on. What do you know about it? And the guy would call in Monday and say, I don't think that's my calling. So we wound up able to construct a team actually over a year's time that pretty much believed in what we were doing.
I was going to do a recap of where we are here, because you do this in the book well. You say, challenges abounded 6 months after taking over the original scope program from Jim Petit. Many doubted your ability to manage. Others questioned the vision. Most seemed uncertain that the strategic and tactical plans would produce positive results. To be truthful, in the dead of the night, my self-doubts were substantial. July 1972 marked my 10th HP anniversary, all with the scope division. A resume showed management of 2 programs, 7 design projects, 1 investigation, 2 circuit designs, and a McGraw-Hill book chapter. The first project sold well to recoup its development costs. The large screen display program discounted my management ability, even though it earned substantial profits. And you created a very useful chart. You called it the 6 stages of leadership capability. And I'd love to share this on the screen, because today's episode coincides with, there's a thing called the Drucker Forum in Vienna. They're friends of the Innovation Show. Okay. And every year they have this 2-day event to celebrate the work of Peter Drucker. But he had a major influence on your career, and particularly to help you develop this. So I'm going to show it on the screen, Chuck, and I'd love you to take us through what you did here, because you've used it since and you still tend to use it.
So the antecedent to this, you get picked to be a leader because you've done some past good work. Okay? You wouldn't have the job if somebody didn't believe in you. And the way they got to believe in you was you made something happen well. Okay? And so when you were doing that, clearly you knew what you were doing. You were probably down here in E&F. For the past project, you had the vision and the plan, and you pulled it off, and so you get the new job. Okay? And the new job is to go into this new arena, the Dweck arena, if you will, where, basically no one knows the rules. And so my description is, okay, what we're supposed to do is solve the problem of digital measurements on logic circuits no one knows anything about. Well, I call that adrift at sea. I have no notion of what to do, and neither does anyone else on the team. So we're adrift at sea. The characteristic of adrift at sea is any direction you paddle might be wrong, right? And then a few things start to sort themselves out, and you say, I think if we work on probing for multiple leads, the guy that I was digging the holes for. I think if we work on some small probes so we can get to multiple leads, that'd be useful. I'm not sure that's the right thing to be working on, but I know it could be useful. Okay. And then you do a bunch of those, and then you say, well, if we do those and use that to do parallel triggers, that feels like a right thing to do. It might not be enough, but it's at least the right thing to be working on. And then you say, we need more than we need parallel, we need serial, we need countdown, we need a host of these things. That's kind of the vision, but you have no idea how to package it yet, how to even invent some of those circuits. And then together with several of your colleagues, you come up with, well, we could do it this way. And now you think you've got a vision and a plan. But when you're talking to the wider team, they say, well, now, wait a minute. You've been screwing around on this for a year and a half. Why should I believe that? It's still like slideware, if you will. And then eventually you get the team aligned and you can pull it off.
I'll share that with the audience. I actually showed that to a scale-up company yesterday, and I said, look, this is really useful. You should actually check this out, because I was reading your book at the time, and I was like, oh, check that out. And they're like, oh, geez, we could do with that. So it's a very useful thing, and you got it then, the team, to check in with it on a regular basis to go, where are we on this, which is really, really useful. I think that people do that. And really importantly, you say, if you don't have a vision yourself, how the heck do you think the team's going to have a vision? And it's important to articulate that regularly.
So one of the issues, you could think where you are is maybe a level 5, but most of your team is still at level 3. They're saying, are you sure this thing I'm working on is the right thing to be working on? And you're down here saying, well, I need that and I need this. And they're not buying into any of that. They're questioning what they're doing themselves, And so yeah, it's a spectrum here. And one of the real tricks is you can get all the way down to the bottom. You think you've got it, and you can't persuade anybody else. Now, you can put this in a startup in 2025 and say, okay, I've got to convince a bunch of venture capitalists about this idea. And they go, what? Are you kidding me? Huh? So a quick story about a different field. When the networking business came along, a bunch of companies got funded by venture capitalists to do local area networks. 3Com was the most prominent company that came out of that period. One company, actually about 5 companies, thought that connecting networks to networks would be very interesting. Instead of connecting computers to a network, they said we ought to connect networks to networks. And Cisco is the prominent company that came out of that period. 3Com got like 42 venture capitalists backing them. Cisco got none out of their first 78 inquiries. None. And yet they made 5 times what 3Com ever made. Well, we're doing one right now with multiple pictures, multiple simultaneous pictures that are pixel streamed, okay, which may not sound like a lot, but it's a big deal. We've got 40 patents on it. And we show it to people, and they all say, multiple pictures? Why would you want to see multiple pictures? Can't you just go through a PowerPoint deck and see one picture after another? Well, sure you can, but you can't compare them. And their eyes glaze over, and you go, guys, well, Zoom is a good example. I invented a bunch of stuff like Zoom and was using it 15 years ago for ACM. I wanted to use it 3 years before COVID came out. And they laughed about, what are you talking about? You'd have to teach people how to use it. I had to mail things for how to dress and how to turn the lights on and all this crap. And then it happens. And today it's an adjective, let's Zoom, right? It's almost laughable from the entrepreneurial standpoint to watch these evolutions.
They come back time and time again. It's like the technology is the only different thing. It's just whatever the entrepreneur has found has changed. But there was a couple of really important things, like you got your team out of the building. And one of the things just to say on vision is there that I'll share as well. You also have a second graph that's perspectives on vision, like you say, where it shows different persons' viewpoint on where they are versus where you are. You might be clear, they may not be not, and the other person on the team may not be either. But in section 2, you spoke of getting the nerds out of the building to meet customers. Few of them knew what to do. So very few of them knew what to do and what to look for. And you said, well, if you knew what to look for, you didn't need to go.
Yeah.
And and I wanted to link it back to something Bill Hewitt, co-founder of HP, said. He said, first, marketing is too important to leave up to marketing people. And second, we believe in the next bench syndrome. I thought that was a really important term. And I'd love you to share this term, the next bench syndrome in HP, but also what you did about paying for engineers to get out and meet customers so they could actually see what the heck they needed.
Well, so the basic issue with engineers traveling, first of all, these are mostly a reclusive, introspective, nerd-type personality. Okay, I mean, a little stereotypical, but basically, these are not your outgoing, glad-handing marketing or sales personality. Okay, so HP had long since decided you never want to send somebody like that out to see a real customer. My God, it would be deflating for all concerned. So rule number 1 is you're just not going to send the engineering team out. Rule number 2 is you don't have any travel money anyway. That is not an allowed kind of thing. We'll have a little bit for a beer bus once a quarter, and we might have a little bit for, the head person to travel a couple times, but that's pretty much it. Well, travel takes money, and it's clear expense money. It's not capital equipment. It's not, et cetera. So we had to overcome those two kinds of things in terms of my bosses giving me approval to have a travel budget. Okay. And to have these uncouth, personalities traveling out to see a real customer. I mean, they would talk about, well, we ought to have him buy some new clothes, or one was we had to teach him some basic hygiene, not to pick his nose in public. And, I mean, it's amazing the things people came up with. But the notion I had was everyone has to take 2 trips a year. And when they get back, they have to report to the group what they saw. Okay. And even if it's hardly anything. And did I have the story about the kid that mailed his airline tickets?
Yeah, you did.
So we had one guy. This guy had 2 master's degrees, was working on a PhD. And we said, where should I go? And we said, Atlanta. And he said, I don't know where that is. And so, well, we got a map out. This is where you go. He gets to the airport and he stuffs his airline tickets in the mailbox and he hands his utility bill to the ticket guy. And I thought, if there's ever a Freudian signal that this guy didn't want to go on the trip, there it is.
I love the fact that you did that, because they could now actually see in the field. This idea of get outside the building is so important. And now it's kind of taken for granted, but you were doing this well ahead of the time.
Well, it wasn't conventional at the time. And we had, in fact, the problem of synchronizing 2 computers basically it's almost like doing the 2 networks tied together. The idea of tying 2 logic analyzers and synchronizing them between 2 computers hadn't been done. And I had even my best engineers explaining why that was unnecessary. It wasn't Dick Cochran, I think it was Bruce Farley, one of our marketing guys, says, well, why don't we just go up and see how that works, right? So we go up to this Fort Collins division, it was 130 miles north, and we hook this stuff up, and they go apeshit over how neat this is. Wow, you can see things. That saved me 6 months of design time, that kind of thing. And our guys on the way, we stopped for dinner, and one of them says, maybe we ought to include that.
Okay, so I love this, because this is stuff that, again, we take it for granted. You fall in love with your own idea. Your team initially wouldn't listen to joining devices together so they could communicate with each other. They didn't see the value in that. But getting out of the building showed them it, and even at that, they still resisted.
A sequel in that. I'm sitting in a talk by Irvin Jacobs, the founder of Qualcomm, at the Computer History Museum, like 35 years later. And he stands up and he tells the entire audience of 600 people, he said, what made it work for Qualcomm was we were able to show IBM how to link two computers together. And we did it with a logic analyzer from Hewlett-Packard. I go up and see him later. It turns out it was my 7th sale. We sold 7 total units when he bought that. And, and he shook my hand. I mean, again, that's the credit that an entrepreneur lives for. I didn't get anything. I didn't get a big plaque from Qualcomm. I don't need one. I had the founder tell me I made his company successful. Wow.
Brilliant. And, there was a couple of things in here. So at one stage, you lost it. So there's a meeting where your sales guy says a projection of 6.6 million. And you're like, that's bullcrap. We do much better than that. Add 10 to it. So let's pick it up from here.
So we launched a primitive product that had sold, I don't know, maybe 2.9 million, maybe not even that the first year. Oh, it was 2.4 million as I remember it. And the next year, 3.9. And now we had 2 new products ready to launch. And the way HP worked at the time is you went out, the marketing manager for your division, and I was still a project team within the division, not my own division. And he goes out and he gets a forecast. He sets a forecast with all of the sales teams. And he came back proudly saying, I got him to go all the way to 16.5 or to 6.5 or 6.6. I've forgotten. Up from 3.9. So he's gotten them to go, like 55%. Okay. And he's just proud as punch. And I just blew a head gasket. For Christ's sake, it ought to be 10 million more than that. It ought to be 16.6, not 6.6. And stormed out of the meeting. There may have been some other words involved. I don't remember exactly, wouldn't play on national television. But left pretty heated, okay? He took it personally. And, he was really upset. And I got counseling. They wanted me to go see a psychologist about how to talk to people. But as it also turned out, he and I made up, and the division manager got behind it, and we put together a brilliant sales plan. And in particular, the guy that I challenged, Bob McVitie was his name, put together the Belt Buckle Award program. And these things became one of the greatest shops you could ever imagine. And now the sequel was we didn't hit 16.6. But we doubled the 6. We did 12.9, I think it was the number, something like that. And then I found everybody felt we had missed. And it was a downer. And I'm thinking, we did 200% of what the guy thought was stupendous. We did wonders. No, we missed our target.
That killed me, man. That's absolutely killed me.
I couldn't believe it.
I had so much empathy here. I'll actually quote it here. You say,
okay.
And I really want our audience to recall that you added 10 million here to the 6.6 in the first place. In fact, you risked things by losing it in that meeting to make your point. But for the fiscal year 1976, the Logic Analyzer Group booked $12.9 million in orders and delivered $11.8 million to customers. Though well short of the 16.6 million goal, it was almost double what the Salesforce quota had been and triple the sales of the previous year. The group sold several hundred units per month, accumulating $38 million in revenues with 17% margins over the next 3 years, yielding a respectable $3.25 million return on investment. You were both earning your way and getting external press by this point. You'd established HP as the logic analyzer leader in the world, and you taught the Salesforce a lesson, but you weren't prepared for the reaction in the overall division or even within your own group. People had internalized 16.6 million or bust, which was your line, to the point that 12.9 million seemed a monumental disaster. Nothing you could say was able to change people's minds. You were tarred with a loser label within the larger division. People even in your own logic division felt that you'd been whipped. Support from the division and executive team waned, both for your group and your leadership. What to do? Your staff was dumbfounded. what was the division executive team missing? And this is what I'd love you to share. It hit you hard. I shared this actually with a private group of people from the Innovation Show subscriber list today. Of course, you say, none of them had ever lived the problem. Your team had visited designers with the problem. AMW attendees had the problem. The HP division staff had only seen PowerPoint slides. Well, actually, I put PowerPoint slides in then. I don't think it existed actually back then.
Remember those foils you did and Honeywell thing?
Yeah. So that point, I think, so I wanted to share firstly, you were a hero. Like you'd done a massive thing, but by over-promising and under-delivering, you were labeled a loser. And we do that in innovation. We do that. And we feel we've done a great job here. And then we're absolutely angry with the company for going, what? I plucked this out of my brain to build this for you. And now you're punishing me for it. And that's one visceral feeling. But then when you calm down and you went, actually, the problem here is they don't actually even know what I'm talking about because all this is a slide to them.
I don't know if you watched America's elections on Tuesday, but we have a mayor of New York and a new governor of Virginia overpromised. They're so exultant with what they did that they promised the moon. And they're just sitting there thinking to myself, don't do that in public. Don't do that. Well, what we did was we built a seminar to teach the larger division what we actually do. Is that what you're referring to?
It was firstly that feeling, because I'm sure that's happened to you before. You've seen other people do it.
It's a conflicted feeling. You blew it away, and yet you're not being honored for it. It's pretty easy to get discouraged. This is a point at which a lot of people leave the corporation. Of the people I've known that have left a company angry, it's almost always something like that. They thought they'd actually scored and they didn't get credit. Or even worse, they got something thrown at them.
Like you said earlier on that you kind of had to keep your head down for a while. The feeling, I've been there, the feeling of that is horrible. You feel, and you're so angry and you feel ashamed and it's so much mixed emotions.
Certainly, I can be an emotional guy, and I was.
So this realization then of, okay, they don't understand, and then you flip to be an educator. This made so much sense to me. I actually left industry to become an educator of sorts because of that. I lecture now, I do workshops, I do keynotes. I started the show because I was like going, this is the problem. They actually don't know what problems you see. And as innovators, sometimes you can see around the corner and you can see things so clearly because you have different information than they do. And maybe you have a bit of imagination as well, but you can connect these dots going forward. And they're so focused on running the business that they miss those things. And this is one of the things I noticed in the HP way was that the company said, oh, let's make engineers able to innovate everywhere. And I'm like, what? You may say that in the HP way, but that's not what happens in the divisions like what happened, Chuck.
So let me, you just triggered something when you talked about your own work. So when I sat down to write the HP Phenomenon, which was a big book, 600 plus pages, we wanted to tell the story of HP innovation. And I had a colleague and we told our story basically. And we had 5 or 6 old timers read it. And they all came back and said, you're telling your story. You're not telling the corporate story or the company story, right? So how do you do that? Well, you go interview a whole bunch of people to ask them what their piece of the story is. And we interviewed about 500 people. Okay. And ultimately, it took us 3 drafts to get a book that we liked and they liked pretty well. And I'm proud of that book. But the key is this. In interviewing those people, while sitting on the Computer History Museum board for years, I kept comparing what I was hearing in my interviews with what they were getting in their interviews. And what they had was historians going back and reading the papers and then maybe having a spot interview with somebody. And they were very plastic. They were very shallow or misguided or came at it from a historian's perspective, not an engineer's perspective. And so I wound up actually revamping both their oral history program and one for the Computing Association. And I've done, and also for Cisco, I did the Cisco Foundation history. And what I found is you've got to do a Socratic interview of the people who did the work. And you get altogether different stories. You get the emotion, you get the why, you get the, it's not what and how, it's who and why. And they're so different. And you actually need them all. You talk about late life learning.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had more fun the last 15 years doing that than anything I've ever done. Talk about an insight.
You just made me think of Steve Jobs, the whole idea of the victors write history. I'm sure Steve Jobs' biography is very different from the actual story of the engineers on the ground. There's one last thing I wanted to show, because you're in a problem time at this stage, and then comes this brilliant moment. And I wanted to share because, again, it's just, if you're lucky here, sometimes things land on your lap. And you landed on this magazine at the time, Electronics Magazine. You were celebrated, you were lauded for your achievement for building a product, and you were celebrated and brought to an event as well. Maybe we'll just finish today with that, because it's a nice cherry on top to say, and a nice positive way to finish, that you actually did really well here and you were recognized for it, which is great to see.
Well, yeah, so we had, the antecedent to that was in, let's say, June. This is October 77 is when that issue came out. Something like March or so of 75, electronics came to our division and said, we want to know about what's really going on. And Bill Farnbach and I drew the short straw. Bill's the guy that was my college, friend and he was sort of my antithesis in logic for a while. Anyway, they wanted to know, and we said, the problem is that electronics is over with. I know that's the title of your book, but it's really the data domain. It used to be the frequency domain. That's how you built all the CW communication world. Then it was the time domain. That's oscilloscopes and switching circuits. Now it's the data domain. It's ones and zeros. They were so skeptical, it was unbelievable. And we had this drag 4-hour discussion with 3 of their editors and Bill and I. And they said, well, why don't you write us some articles? So we wrote 2 articles. I wrote the first one, he wrote the second. They ran in May of 75, May and June. And then as it unfolded, this field took off. Well, 2 years later, they came back and said, okay, bingo, you win this award. And we're going to host you, in New York and all that. It's pretty nice. And I still had the beard. Mountain man is what my wife called me. I got back there, and Bill Moore, great guy, is a classic general manager, or in this case, president of a small company. He didn't have a foggiest idea what a logic analyzer did, at least to my perception. And I was shocked, realized, okay, what happened was they had some entrepreneurs that did really well, and he was able to let them, which is all by itself. Okay. But we didn't have anything to fear from them. We are going to just own this space. So that came out of it. And a great dinner on the 14th floor. I got a bronze plaque. They tried to even chisel my beard into that damn thing. And I could show you that, later. But it was great fun. But you mentioned Steve Jobs, too. Walt Isaacson wrote the chief biography of Steve Jobs. Forgot to mention that it took Steve 8 years to turn Apple profitable after he came back.
Yeah.
7 years of nothing. My wife was there for most of the time, and we know all sorts of backstories on Apple.
Yeah, you'd write a very different book if you tell that story.
Yeah.
The unofficial biography of Apple. Chuck, absolute pleasure, man. You gave us so much time and so much wisdom, and I just think your story is a brilliant story, and people need to hear it, need to listen to the templates that are in it, because it's the same pattern that comes up time and time again. You try and warn just like Pisho did so many of us, about some of the pitfalls to avoid. I really highly recommend the book. It's an easy read. It's a pleasant read, full of ups and downs and full of many insights. We're going to do a part 2 when we share some of those insights that Chuck codified, which are very, very valuable. Chuck, if anybody wants to reach out and find you, do you want them to? And if you do, where can they find you?
Lulu Press is the best place to get it. I need to check and make sure it's still available. I think it is.
It is, man. It is. I actually got mine on Amazon, which is available on Amazon as well, but it is on Lulu. Author of Permission Denied, Odyssey of an Intrapreneur, Chuck House. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.
I want to thank also our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more at kyndryl, Kyndryl.com.